The classroom hummed with nervous energy that morning. It was the day of the school's highly anticipated math competition, a tradition that highlighted the brightest students. The stakes were high. Teachers, judges, parents, and even Principal Waverly were present. For many students, this competition was their chance to prove themselves, a stepping stone to scholarships and accolades. Tiana sat quietly in the back row. Her notebook was open, her pencil tapping lightly against the edge of her desk. To the untrained eye, she looked indifferent, but in reality, her mind was already racing with possibilities. Numbers had always been her sanctuary, her escape from a world that often underestimated her. But today, her love for math wasn't enough to shield her from the palpable tension in the room. Tiana had wanted to participate in the competition for as long as she could remember. Math wasn't just a subject for her, it was her passion. As a child, she'd spend hours solving puzzles with her dad, who always encouraged her to think critically and challenge herself. The world might not see your brilliance right away, he'd told her, but it's your job to show them. Those words stayed with her, a quiet reminder of her potential. But at her school, potential wasn't always recognized. At least, not for students like Tiana. Principal Waverly had made sure of that. Waverly was a man who prided himself on maintaining a certain image for the school. He believed in showcasing students who, in his eyes, represented the school's excellence. And Tiana? To him, she didn't fit the mold. Her achievements were overlooked, her talents dismissed. When she'd signed up for the competition, he'd laughed, a thin, condescending smile on his face. "Let's leave this to the students who are better prepared," he'd said, handing the spot to Ethan, one of his favorite students. The dismissal had stung more than Tiana wanted to admit. She remembered going home that evening, sitting silently at the dinner table as her family chatted around her. Her younger sister, Amara, noticed her mood and nudged her. "What's wrong, Tiana?" she asked, her big brown eyes full of concern. Tiana had forced a smile, brushing it off. "It's nothing," she'd said, but deep down, it wasn't nothing. It was everything. Now, as she sat in the classroom watching Ethan fidget nervously at the front, she felt a mix of emotions. Hurt, frustration, and an undeniable urge to prove herself. Ethan was at the board, struggling with the final equation of the competition. It was a complex problem designed to challenge even the brightest minds. He hesitated, erased his work, and tried again, but the frustration was evident on his face. The room grew tense, whispers spread like wildfire, parents exchanged worried glances, and the math teacher, Mrs. Alvarez, looked on with a mix of sympathy and disappointment. Principal Waverly, standing near the front, cleared his throat. "It seems this problem is a bit too advanced," he said, his voice loud and authoritative. His tone carried an edge, as if he were trying to deflect attention away from Ethan's struggle. His eyes swept the room, pausing briefly on Tiana before moving on. It was a glance she recognized, a look of dismissal, of someone who didn't believe in her. Tiana felt her heart pounding in her chest. She'd already solved the problem in her head. She could see the solution so clearly, it was as if it were written in neon lights. But could she speak up? Would anyone even listen? Her hands clenched into fists under the desk. She thought of Amara, of her parents, of all the times she'd been overlooked and underestimated. And then, she thought of her dad's words. "It's your job to show them." Taking a deep breath, she raised her hand. The room went silent. Every eye turned toward her. "I'll try," she said, her voice steady but firm. Principal Waverly raised an eyebrow. His lips curled into a smirk. "You think you can solve this, Tiana?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. Tiana didn't respond to his tone. Instead, she stood, walked to the front of the room, and picked up the chalk. The whispers in the room grew louder. Some students snickered. Others watched in curiosity. For a moment, she stood at the board, her back to the room, staring at the equation, and then she began to write. Her movements were precise, her handwriting neat and deliberate. As she explained her process, the room fell into a stunned silence. She broke the equation down into smaller parts, each step flowing seamlessly into the next. The chalk moved across the board with a rhythm, her voice confident and clear. Even Mrs. Alvarez, who had taught math for over a decade, looked impressed. The judges leaned forward, their pens frozen in mid-air. Tiana wasn't just solving the problem, she was teaching it, breaking it down in a way that made it look effortless. When she wrote the final number and circled it, she turned to face the room. For a moment there was silence, and then the applause began. It started with Mrs. Alvarez, who clapped so loudly it echoed through the room. The students joined in, some cheering her name. Even the judges stood, nodding in approval. But Principal Waverly? He stood frozen, his face pale with embarrassment. Tiana met his gaze, her expression calm but unwavering. "Never underestimate someone because of what you think they're capable of," she said, her voice steady. The impact of her words was palpable. Waverly looked away, his usual smug demeanor replaced by shame. The aftermath of that day rippled through the school. Students began speaking out about the principal's biases, sharing their own experiences. Parents demanded change, and Waverly was forced to address his actions publicly. He issued an apology to Tiana and her family and agreed to undergo sensitivity training. As for Tiana, her life changed forever. Her performance caught the attention of local organizations, and she received scholarships and invitations to advance math programs. But, more importantly, she became a symbol of resilience and brilliance for her peers. Her little sister Amara hugged her tightly that evening. "You showed them," she said, beaming with pride. And Tiana? She smiled for the first time that day. Because she hadn't just solved a math problem, she'd solved a much bigger problem, the perception of what she was capable of. Her story became an inspiration, a reminder that brilliance knows no boundaries. And for anyone watching, the message was clear. Don't let the world define your worth. Show them who you are.